Tammy. And hello, everybody who's watching and listening. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Just going to sort out a little sound issue. And we'll start.
I can't hear anything. You can hear me?
We can.
So, were we introduced? Am I talking now? I'm sorry, I didn't hear anything.
Okay. I'll start the introduction and I'll bring you in, okay? Okay, so this session is titled
Rob,
Can
perhaps you
Agriculture...
can introduce prep while Vince tries to get me sound.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure exactly what happened. Tammy, your sound just completely cut out. I guess Tammy's not able to hear me. So just bear with us for a minute, everybody, and we'll get this sorted out just real quick.
Yeah.
Tammy, can you hear us now?
Is somebody talking?
Okay, sorry guys, one moment. Tammy, did you by any chance hit a mute button on your computer or a
No. Let me try my... I'm in Chrome. Nothing on my AirPods either. Oh wait, I hear ticking. I hear typing.
You hear us?
Tammy, can you hear us now?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, it must have switched to your AirPods without you knowing. Okay, so here we go. We're back.
Okay.
No more tech problem screen. Thank you all in the audience for your patience, and take it away,
Sorry.
Ian.
Okay, thanks, Vince. Thanks for rescuing us. Much appreciated. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this session of the ORFC Can Agriculture Stop COVID-21, 22 and 23. I'll just give you a little bit of a blurb at the beginning and then I'll introduce the two speakers and then we'll crack on with the session. So the ORFC, for those who know and don't know, was established about 10 years ago as a counter conference to the establishment Oxford Farming Conference. It's a radical, ecological and democratic alternative to a corporate vision of agribusiness and intensification. And as the years have gone by, the conference has grown in reputation and societal relevance. Its advocacy of agroecology and a more humane approach towards the human food chain has matured into a solid platform from which alternatives to neoliberal agriculture have been explored and shared. Now, this year's ORFC International Online Conference continues in that vein, and the session carries a particular relevance because it's discussing the role of agriculture in the global pandemic that has caused us to not merely move online, but to use that necessity with international creativity. Mainstream discussions, political and media, are happy to discuss the causes and consequences of COVID-19 and the pandemic on the proviso that we don't go too deep. We don't explore the fundamental links between the pandemic and other things in the wings with reference to the neoliberal status quo. The role of corporate agriculture and the alternatives of democratic agroecology have received very little attention in the mainstream. And the speakers in this session will rectify that. And we look forward to your thoughts and the discussion ahead. We've got two great speakers. Rob Wallace is an evolutionary epidemiologist at the Agroecology and Rural Economics Research Corps and an organizer with Pandemic Research for the People. He's author of Big Farms Make Big Flu and Dead Epidemiologists on the Origins of COVID-19. consulted with the Food and Agricultural Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Welcome, Rob. Tammy Jonas, Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, Meat Smith's Pandemic Research for the People. Tammy Jonas is an agroecologist in principle and in practice, farming heritage breed large black pigs, cattle and garlic with her husband Stuart on the unceded lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people in the Central Highlands of Victoria. Tammy is president of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, co-editor and co-author of Farming Democracy, Radically Transforming the Food System from the Ground Up, and undertaking a PhD at the University of Western Australia on the biodiverse and decolonising practices of agroecological farmers with rare and heritage breed livestock. Welcome, both of you, and over to you.
Thanks, Ian. It's great to be here. I actually, I thought we had planned to do this after, but I thought Rob should probably first introduce PrEP a little bit. And before he does that, I'd like to quickly tell people that Rob, as the consummate academic, ratbag, non-academic, is an excellent comrade who I was fortunate to meet in America many years ago through another agroecologist, Jahi Chappelle. And over the years, he has been one of the most ardent supporters of farmers in having a say and farmer-to-farmer knowledge sharing. And we've co-written a number of chapters and papers, and he's legitimate as an academic about pulling in farmers to come and share the expertise that we have. And it's only later that I've come back to the academy myself as well, and am now a farmer scholar. But yeah, it's been a long collaboration, and it's really nice for us to be here together to share some of the work that we've been doing recently with all of you. But Rob, do you want to introduce PrEP?
Yeah, sure. Well, part of it in terms of working with farmers, it was always a very good thing to do in terms of the ethics of research. But in addition, I don't know anything about agriculture, so you better be talking. It's very important to talk to people who know what they're talking about, and in terms of working with farmers on agricultural issues, it's important to do. And this is kind of the ethos that went into pandemic research for the people. Once the COVID-19 arrived here in the States and really took off in March, a group of us realized that many of the needs in terms of what people need to learn about what was going on with the outbreak weren't being met. So a group of us, researchers, farmers, food activists, urban activists, all sorts of people put together Pandemic Research for the People, put together some working groups. We have PrEP Neighborhoods, which is dedicated toward urban issues. We have PrEP Rural, dedicated to the outbreak as it relates to rural people and rural areas. We have PrEP Agroecologies, which is what we're going to be talking about today in terms of the dispatch that we wrote. And we've been writing these dispatches and putting them out to the public to try to get issues that are at the center of what is going on with the outbreak. And obviously, governments around the world have failed millions of people in terms of their needs and what's the solutions to the ongoing pandemic. So that's what we're doing. We have, you can find us at prepthepeople.net, and you'll have all our dispatches there, our working groups. And if you're interested in participating, give us a holler.
Thanks, Rob. And that's a collaboration that is going on. We're trying to make it more international, I suppose. We've got sort of America and Australia and little bits of other parts of the world included, but I think more is needed for this kind of work. My task actually at the moment is simply to define a little bit of what we think agroecology is as a solution going forward. And then Rob's going to bring you back to the problems of agribusiness and the way that they're selecting for diseases like COVID. As I think probably anybody who's joined this session already knows, agroecology doesn't select for disease, it selects for health. And it does so by growing food actively in ecosystems rather than as though we're separate from them. And agroecology as a practice, before it was a word that got coined sometime in the 80s, it seems, maybe the 70s. Before that, Indigenous peoples and traditional farmers all over the world have been practicing forms of agroecology for a very, very long time. And central to some of the research I'm doing is the the way that thinking agroecologically needs to be thinking with ecosystems rather than in those human exceptionalist sort of ways that have been handed down to us from centuries of monotheism and the Enlightenment, so-called, that gave us the ideas of splitting our bodies from our minds and our whole selves from the nature that surrounds us. So, I mean, in shorthand, we know that agroecology is often described as a science, a set of practices, and a social movement. And I think that there are often discussions around regenerative agriculture as well as agroecology that forget the social movement part of it, but it's fundamental to what agroecology is. And so some people also, like the governments of the world, like to forget that agroecology has science behind it in terms of the way that ecosystems work. And Rob's certainly going to talk more to that in a moment because, in fact, he is a scientist. And I speak better to the sets of practices, like on my own farm, running pastured pigs and cattle, and growing garlic. So the garlic arose, for example, from the fact that we have obviously manure from animals being raised on pasture. We also have a butcher shop on our farm. So when we finish processing the animals, the bones that aren't used, or even after they're used to make bone broths or stock for our members, we're a CSA, they're then put into a retort and pyrolyzed to make bone char. Bone char is this incredibly nutrient-rich, like biochar, product, so that's high in magnesium and holds carbon and phosphorus. And so you take that and you put it into a biofertilizer and it activates, and then that becomes the richest sort of biofertilizer we can have. It's made from whey, molasses, bone char, cow manure, pig manure. They're all sort of bubbling away in a barrel, and then that gets put out onto our garlic and makes an incredible crop of garlic for us every year. And the decision was that we had a high nutrient creation from having animals on the farm, and we needed to use it to extract some more of that to keep the cycle working on the farm that we run. So that's made for, I mean, we harvested 400 kilos of garlic this year, and we're a very tiny farm. So for us, that was a lot. You know, we're not agribusiness where you talk in terms of how many thousands of tons. But then the other part of it being a social movement, as the president of the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, obviously I advocate for food sovereignty alongside many other farmers and our allies across the system. And La Via Campesina, being the most obvious and famous and largest social movement in the world, has been advocating for agroecology and for peasants' rights for over 30 years now, and many of them are speaking at the conference this week. Our organization is also a member of La Via Campesina. The International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty is the other global instrument, I guess, for social movements, where we all form an alliance and we speak to the UN bodies in particular. Its particular role is to articulate to the FAO and the Convention on Biological Diversity, which currently has the Global Biodiversity Framework underway, where we're trying to insert the voices of peasants, saying biodiversity isn't something that happens from the farm boundary onwards. It actually happens, it needs to happen inside the farm boundaries as well. And we need to stop thinking about these as boundaries. They need to be far more porous with the ecosystems in which we exist, because they are, whether we like it or not. So when we think about, for example, our farm, we think about our relationship as we're in a catchment, where the water is coming in to us and where it's going after it leaves us. And in Australian Aboriginal cosmologies, there are things called song lines, where traditionally you sing those song lines to understand what's upstream and downstream, so that you can't do damage beyond the area that's in your custodianship. You're passing it on to those that come after you. And thinking agroecologically for me means very much tapping into those kinds of ways of understanding what our farmscapes are part of. What are they situated in? Who are they affecting? Not only us, but those who are downstream from us, or those who are upstream from us. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, what I think agroecology is. It's thinking in all of those ecosystem and social system ways. And as an Indigenous scholar here in Australia said in a book called Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, a book I commend to all of you highly, he says he's often asked, or he hears new cultures ask, why are we here? In that big nihilist question, what is the point of us? And he says, well, isn't it obvious? We're here to care for the things on the land and in the air and everything in between in our time. And for me, that's what custodianship is. It's to understand our role here and to do our best to care for the things around us, and hope that that ecosystem is kind of thinking of us in the same way. Now, Rob, do you want to tell us the bad news?
Yeah, well, Dr. Doom here. Well, all the kind of agrobiodiversity that Tammy's speaking about, that is, an inherent part of a lot of indigenous and smallholder practice around the world, has been increasingly and unfortunately attacked and swept away and replaced by the kind of monoculture that is in essence driving all these outbreaks. So you go back, turn of the century, you had the beginning of the emergence of these celebrity pathogens. If you remember H5N1 emerging out of Guangdong in southern China. You have other influenza strains. We have H1N1, 2009, the swine influenza that emerged outside Mexico City before spreading around the world. All sorts of different types of influenzas. H5N2 here in the Midwest, the United States, H5NX in Europe. H7N9 in China again, all sorts of different strains of influenza. But of course, also in addition, if you remember, from the past 20 years, we had indeed SARS-1 in 2002 emerge. You had MERS in 2012, another coronavirus. You had Ebola out of West Africa. We had Zika emerge, do considerable damage in Brazil. And so you have these previously marginalized pathogens suddenly become regionalized, or even make it out onto the global travel network, becoming pandemics, or at least doing considerable regional damage. And those things, that increase in the rate and the diversity of pathogens are emerging is directly related to the damage that agribusiness is doing on two accounts. One, stripping the last of the forest to turn it into monoculture farmland, both crop and livestock, and also increasing or decreasing the diversity in the other direction of what Tammy was saying, but decreasing diversity on farm and across region, which increases the likelihood that a pathogen that does considerable damage actually can succeed. And we'll get into some of the mechanics of that in due course. But the way I think about it is I think of it as a circuit of production, and the circuit of production is being kind of rubber stamped all around the world. And you have agribusiness and mining and logging increasingly cutting into the forest. That basically destroys the forest not only as a resource, but as a cultural process, as a ecological practice in which pathogens can't really line up all sorts of different hosts to be able to just shoot out there. If you're a deadly pathogen, it's very difficult to line up different hosts to be able to get a chain of transmission going that way. And and forests, as we very well know, are not just these kind of things out of nature. There's a lot of research in the last few decades about how food forests around the world are very much cultivated and built by indigenous groups and smallholders over thousands of years. And so this thing in the global north, as we see as nature, is actually a land sharing, a land that is shared between the non-human species and the human species as well. So what agribusiness does, it's kicks the humans out, strips the forest of its ecological complexity, and those pathogens that were previously marginalized all of a sudden have increased interface with humans and livestock there, who are subsequently shipped from one side of the world to the other. So now all of a sudden they're miniaturized space in which they can operate becomes the entirety of the world. So that's at the forest end of production. More toward the city, in terms of our circuit of production, you have increasing numbers and of more industrial farms. Also the shed farming that goes, a livestock of 250,000 birds per barn, or 15,000 turkey per barn, all genetically pretty much the same, selecting. So you have the decline in the diversity of the animals in such a way that if you're from the vantage point of a virus, it selects for the more virulent pathogens. And the way you can think about it this way, if you're a pathogen and you're in a host, you don't want to be too much of a badass. You don't want to kill your host too fast before you get into the next host, because if it's not there, then you will die off as a lineage. But if the next host is right there and it's genetically the same and you don't have to figure out its immunity, then that takes the cap off on the damage to your lineage for being so virulent, because you need to replicate up to what's called a kind of the transmission threshold over which you can move from one animal into the next. So if you're all packed in at 15,000 birds like that, and they're all genetically the same, then it selects for those strains that are going to do the most damage. And that goes not only within barn, but between barns and across farms. A lot of industrial farming is done in a regional basis to control for the costs of scale there, so the trucks can all just pick up all the birds in one spot before shipping them into the city. So that's the kind of the other end of the a circuit of production. And then you have pathogens that are emerging. So, on terms of the front end of it, the forest end of it, you have something like Ebola, which when palm oil plantations moved into West Africa, allowed the bats there to actually migrate to the plantations. They really like the plantations. They didn't just die off with their forests destroyed, and that increased the interface in such a way that Ebola can more easily spread in terms of the frequency and diversity of the strains. And so you end up with an outbreak that was typically, before the West African outbreak, you had Ebola strains primarily concentrated in, spilling over in a village or two, taking out the village is a terrible thing. But now, by virtue of the structural adjustment programs, by virtue of allowing multinational companies in, you've in essence allowed the monoculture agribusiness to move into the forest, and Ebola is now spilling over at a greater rate, and then is able to, by virtue of many of the people who work in the forest having to be driven out and having to work in the cities to fill in their holes in their budgets. You have an Ebola that spills over into local labor, and then they make their way to the city, and then you have an outbreak that infects 35,000 people and kills 11,000. On the other end, in terms of the kind of more closer to the city, you have pathogens like those influenzas that I remarked on that are emerging that way as they make their way to the city and then onto the global travel network. And then you have strains like the COVIDs and Zika, like the SARS and Zika, that are emerging all along that kind of production circuit through the peri-urban area, from the deepest forest through the peri-urban area, which is increasingly both urbanized and into the city. And that's our vision about what's happened with SARS-2. That's the virus that causes COVID-19. When SARS-1, and I'll wrap up with my story of SARS and we'll open up the conversation here. But when SARS-1 emerged in 2002, there's a lot of work that went into investigating the distribution of these coronaviruses and they found them all sorts of different strains in bats through Central and South China. As Chinese engaged in their version of agribusiness, as they took the bricks rolled for capitalist production and decided to, go that way of development, they encroached upon their own forests in a way that increased the interface with bats, more the way we describe with Ebola in Africa. And so coronaviruses began to spill over at a more rapid pace. And in fact, we've had 3 major coronavirus events in only 18 years. So in all likelihood, we're going to be having additional spillover events of deadly coronaviruses. This is why we speak about in our prep dispatch along the lines of COVID-21, COVID-22, and COVID-23. And so it's our vision that we have to go in the other direction. We can't just strip out the forest. We can't reduce agrobiodiversity. We need to go in the other direction. And very much along the lines of what Tammy described, agroecology is the way forward to keep the worst of these pathogens from emerging in the first place.
Actually, Rob, was thinking as you were talking, something we talk about in the dispatch, which I've shared a link with there. I don't know if there's a way that magically goes to the other the public chat, but that's the link to the dispatch we're discussing. You didn't go into the details of the land sparing versus land sharing argument. And I mean, I think most people have heard this common sense argument. Well, if these virulent pathogens are coming out of forests, don't we need to block off the forests? Isn't that a logical response? We need to stop going into these pristine forests, Rob. What do you have to say to that?
Well,
in Australia, we call that a Dorothy Dixer.
Okay. Well, there's two things. One, there is an aspect of we're losing the deepest forests, and there are questions of whether or not we can engage in what's called, strategic rewilding of areas that have been stripped of their of forests and such. But that's shouldn't be in the hands of people who are engaged in the worst of the deforestation in the first place. And I think what it's being used of is a way of driving out Indigenous and smallholders so that the forest can grow back. But it's really about land grabbing. It's the next generation of greenwashing the worst of the agribusiness companies. They are very much in favor of the kind of conservation that would drive smallholders, Indigenous out. Who often represent the last of the resistance to that kind of land grabbing. In the end, and you brought it up, land sharing, land sparing, and this has been a debate going on several decades in the ecological literature and also in conservation policy. And in the end, it's just they're using the pathogen as just the next framework by which to argue Indigenous need to be kicked out. And I think when in the end, really, Indigenous and smallholders and agroecologists play a fundamental role in helping preserve forest diversity and complexity needed to box in some of those worst of those pathogens. And in the end, it's been something of a long argument, but but at the same time, we are confronted with some fundamental existential crises that are making this very much a sharp argument that we need to continue to push back against the notion that preserving forests means pushing people out. If you want to push people out, we can push out the agribusinesses that have been there and strip the forest.
Absolutely. And I see there's a question coming in, but I just want to respond as well to what you've said, Rob, with the testing questions that I use from a food sovereignty perspective. Whenever solutions are proposed, no matter who proposes them, when there are solutions proposed, I go back to the definition of food sovereignty, right? So the definition is that we're advocating for the right of everyone to access culturally appropriate and nutritious food grown and distributed in ecologically sound ways, and our right to democratically determine our own food and agriculture systems. So when somebody says to me, well, is blocking off the forest the right answer? Then I'm going to go back to the point you just made. Who's blocking the forest off? Who's maintaining control of that forest when this happens? Who's losing access to traditional lands when they do this? Were the people involved in the decision? Can people still grow their own food where they traditionally have? So those questions immediately knock out the land sparing argument from a sense of anything that's been traditionally managed by Indigenous peoples and peasants for a long time. And then there's, the next questions are like, so what's the alternative? What are people going to access to eat there as well? Will it be culturally appropriate for them? Are you going to bring in Mars bars, as their calories? And will it be nutritious as well as culturally appropriate? So all of those testing questions are something I apply to you take biotech, you take lab meat, you take any of these solutions to the problems that industrial agriculture has created. Usually the solutions are proposed by the same people, as you said, who made the problems, in which case it's pretty quick to discount them as solutions. But it can be hard because you think, feedlots and animals in sheds are causing disease as well as being a welfare nightmare and an ethical nightmare. But so surely we should grow that meat in a lab, right? Oh, can I grow meat in a lab on my home? Is that culturally appropriate? Is that going to be nutritious even? What are the unintended consequences of that move? So I just like to throw in how I approach all of those food systems problems when somebody comes up with, well, we've got to protect the forests. Okay, sure, that sounds good on the face of it. Now ask a bunch of questions.
Yeah, the funny thing is, agribusiness hates nature. I mean, I mean, that's the thing. They view nature as a competitor. So once you strip out your soil and you don't have any nutrients in there, and once you destroy your water, once you destroy, if you destroy the local ecology so that you don't have birds and bats eating your pests, agribusiness can now sell it to you. And
Right.
so, what they're interested in doing is locking in farmers in as and as kind of end buyers. So if they can strip as much of nature out, that is in essence these ecosystem services, to use a reductionist term, but these services that nature provides largely for free, as long as we also involved in taking care of things and taking care of it in the way that indigenous and smallholders know for thousands of years. Once you strip those things out, then we have to buy them. So you have to buy your
Yeah. Exactly.
petrochemical, fertilizers, your pesticides, and in fact, they're actually stripping out the farmer mind. So now you need to use computers that they're offering, big data and precision agriculture now. So in essence, now I think about it, the war against the indigenous and smallholder and the agroecologist isn't just about land grabbing. It's about stripping out an alternative that offers all the things we need to persist as a species, as humanity, and that's we've done so for many hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of years, and so this is agribusiness's war against both human and humanity and nature, which might
Well,
lead
because we're one and the same, which gets to that question, and I think there's the question of the false dichotomy between nature and society is being hashed out, in philosophy across the cultures for years and years, for millennia, and I think James Scott, in Seeing Like a State, he writes about the metis of the peasants and indigenous peoples, which is the way of thinking that is based on experiential knowledge of being in their ecosystems and being there for season after season and seeing how things happen in a way that a scientist who tests things in a lab will never understand. They simplify things to the point that they can't understand how a crop reacts in an actual ecosystem because they test it in a controlled environment, which is not what nature is. And indigenous peoples and peasants have known this forever, that they're part of the ecosystems, because nobody ever, well, it's not true that nobody ever put them in a lab, but let's pretend that those who have never been put in a lab, they know they're part of an ecosystem because they have to respond and react and be part of it on a daily basis. And that notion of metis and the knowledge that comes from being embedded in your ecosystem, I think, is really important, and one that hasn't really been lost by particularly the indigenous peoples. I think more of the peasants have been dragged into agribusiness endeavors and its bounded spaces. But that's, I think, the fight that we're in right now with agroecology is to drag everyone back from that notion that humans are exceptional and that actually we are simply part of nature. And sure, we may have particular custodial responsibilities because whether we should, we can and we do manage ecosystems. And so there's a question of what role we want to play there in that custodial role. And think of it less as management. And to your point about ecosystem services and natural resources, I do also just have to say, I was alerted many years ago, and I've read a lot since, about how much most Indigenous people hate the words ecosystem services and natural resources. They want to talk about nature. They don't want to talk about natural resources because that implies they're there to be exploited. And it's really hard to find the language to not do those things. And I'm still struggling with it in my own work. But something I try constantly is to not think of them as resources, because that suggests they're already mine somehow, or somebody, so I can buy it from them,
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, I'm as much part of a system that I oppose. So I'm trying to unpack the premises of many of these arguments, and so we all are attempting to grow out of the traps of our culture's own making. And so, in some sense, and there's a necessity of being a little bit more humble and sitting back and allowing peoples of the global South and indigenous groups to come forward and lead the way. and they're not. We are in the position to do the work necessary to arrive at these places of understanding, and I think it's critical. And that, to go to the question that was asked about spillover, that goes to, well, what is our relationship with pathogens and pests? Nobody wants to get sick, of course, but to the extent to which pathogens and pests are always going to be around, is there a way by which we can manage them, to use a terrible word, in terms of the agroecologies we deploy? In some sense, farmers are already doing that. If you have a lot of agrobiodiversity within farm and across farms, that is locking out pathogens that can burn through as many hosts as possible. But by relationships with them, is that they are going to be around, and to the lengths to which we can better deploy our farming in a way that perhaps allows the less virulent ones, less deadly ones, to circulate, to act as a kind of natural vaccine, as it were, so that our animals can, if they were infected, they're not just going to keel over. The other thing that agribusiness doesn't do is that it doesn't allow its animals to reproduce on site, which is crazy to me, because it doesn't allow for natural selection to work in our favor, in the sense that if say a terrible pathogen comes and knocks out a flock, and there might be a few birds still walking around that can serve as the progenitors of the next generation, because they have some work in their immunogenetics that allowed them to survive the outbreak. And Big Ag doesn't do that at all. There is no reproduction on site. All the breeding is done at the grandparent level offshore for morphometric characteristics like faster growth or bigger breasts or something like that. And so they have basically completely stripped any capacity of the herd or flock to defend itself, and the farmers are on the hook to use what revenue that they have to buy the vaccine or the antibiotic in order to do anything about the disease. And as we already know, vaccines take a while to develop, and so we're learning this lesson horribly this year. But when H5N2 decimated 40 million birds here in the Midwest, they came up with a vaccine, but it was already too late. So, it's just post hoc interventions that have nothing to do with biosecurity. That's the thing we should characterize, that they use biosecurity as a weapon to beat down on smallholders and agroecologists, and there's nothing biosecure of packing in 250,000 birds in the same place. It's just a powder keg, and then maybe they change the wooden plates around the keg, made them metal, but it's still a powder keg. And agroecologists are, just by dint of doing their day-to-day farming, are in the business of short-circuiting pathogens from doing that kind of damage.
Yeah, if I can give a quick example there about your point about reproduction on site, because I'm not sure for those who are not farmers, perhaps the conversation feels new and you're not sure exactly what Rob's carrying on about there. But in short, on a farm like mine, the sows all give birth to the piglets on site. They pass on their immunity through their colostrum and through raising those babies. They stay all in the same environment in the same bacterial environment, if you'd like, and they develop their immunities through living and being and shitting in the same place, and then moving through healthy environments, and not being picked up from there and now taken to a totally foreign environment that they don't have natural antibodies for. So there's actually a famous permaculturalist in Australia, David Holmgren, who's one of the co-founders. His partner, Sue Dennett, she talks about how when she travels, which she doesn't do anymore, but when she used to travel, when she arrived in a foreign country, the first thing she would do was access their fermented foods to get that into her gut, to start to seed her gut flora with the local biota. And I think that's kind of an interesting version of what we're saying, and it maybe isn't effective enough when you actually land and you're drinking dirty water in a place that you really don't have a stomach for. But the point being, start to get the right bacteria for that environment into you, so that you're less likely to get sick. more quickly. And I think that's the point of reproducing on site, right, Rob, is to keep the immunity strong, because you're actually literally growing it through generations.
Right. So you're improving immunity, and you're also reducing the pathways by which the worst pathogens could survive and do well. So both those things together. So Tammy, we've got amazing questions coming in. It's kind of blowing my mind. I feel like I'm at dissertation test here or something. This is pretty amazing. But let me throw one at you, because they're getting at the questions of, okay, how do we make this into agroecology, get out from underneath the kind of large conservation organizations, and how do we hold them accountable? And then the question of what are some governance levers by which we can pull to push back against big ag and big food's destructive practices on this question?
Well, look, I'm looking at that question. I think the one about the bingos. So the problem with large conservation organizations is that they're often wolves in sheep's clothing, right? So in the global movement with the IPC and La Via Campesina, we've had dealings with NGOs who fundamentally misunderstand agroecology and the fact that in our movements, the people speak for ourselves. We don't need the experts to come and speak for us. And that sort of goes back to what I was saying about Rob's and my relationship for many years. Coming in as an expert who wants to help lift the voices and support it with the science that actually can back up what's already known by the practitioners, on the land, is important. And you get NGOs who come in with a very different approach, and they'll talk over Indigenous peoples and peasants, and they have their own solutions. And quite often that's going to be coming with vested interests. There's a funding stream that is available to them if they push a particular line, whether it's blocking out particular forests, whether it's rewilding. There's this madness of what is that thing, Rob, the half earth? What's that half earth thing?
Yeah, just half Earth that will get rid of humanity out of half the Earth, and drive them into the cities, so that we can do some rewilding and Earth can heal.
Edward O. Wilson is the
E.O. Wilson, Tim Robinson. There's a whole batch of them of various political positions from left to right.
Yeah. So again, sometimes these things sound like a common sense idea, especially if you're in a city. You might go, well, we're kind of already here anyway, so maybe just some more of us need to be in cities, because that wilderness seems a little damaged out there. But then go and follow the argument for its logical inconsistencies about whether that's a sensible thing to do, but also whether there's money attached to any of the solutions being proposed by those who are pushing them hardest, and fighting it back to the question of, like, how do we fight against some of that. In the global governance spaces, it's really hard, to be honest. They have huge amounts of money, and the social movements, the grassroots social movements, don't. And so we're fortunate that various UN bodies choose to fund our efforts to be there to bring the voices of people from the land. But when they choose not to, it's very hard for us to be there. And the likes of I'm not going to go and name a bunch of funds, but the likes of some of the big conservation organizations who can afford to be there, they control the voice. So the best thing that we can keep doing is ensuring that the voice of the people is... Actually, I was going to raise the UN Food System Summit as an example of this. So some of you will have heard that the UN is hosting the next Food System Summit in 2021, and normally that should have come from the World Committee on Food Security to lead that process in collaboration, with the FAO and the Food and Agriculture Organization. And instead, what happened was that the General Secretary of the UN called the Food System Summit, and therefore has kind of complete control over the process, and appointed the head of AGRA, the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, as the chair of that process. And what looks from the outside, if you're not deeply involved in the international spaces, it looks like they're trying to have a bottom-up process that invites you to come to these food systems dialogues at the national level, at the regional level. You can host your own food systems dialogues. But meanwhile, there are democratically constituted and organized bodies around the world, like IPC and La Via Campesina, who are not being given a role to play where we have mandates from the people around the world who've told us what the needs are. We've been working together for 30 years on these problems, and they haven't come to those bodies. They've gone and handpicked that consultancy and that government-funded conservation body and that startup. And do those sound like democratic organizations to you? Because they're not. So that's who's leading the Food System Summit. And in the movement, the decision was made by the IPC and La Via Campesina not to participate, but that the members of IPC and La Via Campesina might choose to in their own right. That's a matter for them, obviously. But we kind of thought, if we turn up to this Food System Summit, what's going to happen is all of us peasants and Indigenous peoples are going to sit in the room, and we're going to be focus grouped. And they're going to then take what we tell them to turn it into, is this the right time to share that, do you think, Rob?
Sure.
This is the right time to share what happens when they workshop us and they take our language. So this is CropLife International, one of the biggest names in agribusiness. They rep the likes of Monsanto, and they're everywhere. And they've decided to tell us what agroecology is. And if you look at the screen, enabling people in institutions is interesting, right? Technical support and training enables farmers to make informed decisions. That's not what that is in agroecology. In agroecology, enabling people in institutions is about people having the power to share their knowledge with each other and grow their knowledge together. It's not about being trained by extension services, or certainly not by the likes of CropLife. If you look at the research, should be evidence-based, etc. But who's doing the research? Look at land, things like no-till. I mean, sure, but there's a lot more than no-till. That's been one of the ones I think that agribusiness has latched onto the strongest. And a lot of no-till practices, I'm sure many of you know, have heavy use of chemical sprays to be able to do no-till. Not all no-till, but quite a lot. Production talks about using technology such as crop protection and biotech products. That's an interesting take on agroecology. I'm pretty sure we've been rejecting biotech as a false solution for agroecology for a very long time. So that's just, I'm going to stop. Well, I'll stop sharing the screen. You can look at that on the CropLife website yourself. But it's again, to the point, it's not just the conservation agencies who are giving us some grief at the moment. It's the likes of the big, powerful agribusiness who are trying to use the language of agroecology now and take it away from what it actually is intended to be.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the big picture, and we haven't used the C word yet, but I mean, this is, the next generation in racial capitalism. I mean, this is
right.
The global North smashing the global South. Historically speaking, going back 500 years, the global North has used the global South as both its refrigerator and its toilet, and it wants to continue to do so. And you have the horrible things that happen in Washington D.C., the more vicious racial versions of this, but that doesn't mean that what CropLife is offering here isn't also part and parcel of doing exactly that kind of thing. So pushing back, what do we do? I mean, obviously solidarity is going to win the day. I mean, it has to. Agroecologists have to start speaking to each other across various divides, within country, across countries, across global North, global South. We have to have our Indigenous and global South brothers and sisters up front, in terms of helping direct traffic about what we need to do. And I think, in addition, we need to break through that divide between urban and rural. It's been going on for too long. When you live in a society where you don't know where your food's coming from, that rural thing doesn't, somewhere else. It's a place. But once you go back to more the kind of regional kind of food systems, that you get a better sense of the relationship between rural and urban, not just as an ecosystem, but as a political process. And those things can be done within country and across countries. And I think that is not something that we can do in the next year. I mean, it's going to take a while. It's a generational project. But as we are faced with the kind of existential crises of these repeated pandemics that are on our way, with climate change, we have no choice, and we are at a moment, historical crossroads, that we can really make some headway in terms of getting out of this trap.
Yep. Yeah, and I would just add to your point about international solidarity, Rob, something you and I have talked about a lot, that, you know, we say globalization got us into this mess. Internationalization is what's going to get us out. And this conference is a really excellent example of that, of bringing together people from every corner of the globe to talk about the work being done all over the world, but also then hopefully to continue to collectivize us so that we don't keep doing this in atomized ways, that we actually do it together, because we won't be able to make the changes we need unless we have a collective force, if you like. And that can't just stop at the national bounded space. That needs to be across much bigger spaces. And we give the example in Australia of farmers saying that they're being hurt by, cheap imports from all over the world. And I mean, I know it's a bit rich in Australia to be complaining about that at all, given how much Australia mostly exports its food and damages other economies around the world. And that's a point that we make when the farmers are concerned about the cheap imports. Is sure, what you're concerned about is agribusiness. You're concerned about industrial agriculture and its sheer scale and its capacity to dump its cheap food in places where you could have provided that as a smallholder. So when we think about China from Australia as some kind of monolithic idea of the problems that it dumps in Australia, think about the problems Australia is dumping in China on its smallholders. And let's think in solidarity with the peasants of China. And how can we actually work together? China's actually a difficult example because social movements are illegal there. So it's not probably the best example for how to have as much solidarity as we would like, because it's just really difficult to organize there. But in other parts of Asia, we're much better at, like with Indonesia or South Korea. We're heavily collectivized with them through La Via Campesina and working on the problems together and learning more of the problems, like, the live export problem from Australia. So, and the death of many animals in live export. And in Australia, we get fed this line that that is because to make these animals halal, they need to have been killed in a certain way. And so you can't have them killed in our abattoirs if they're not halal. When I was in Indonesia with our comrades from SPI, they said to me, "What are you talking about? They tell you that's nonsense. A halal death means it has to have had a halal life. And as soon as you put those animals on the boat, it's not halal anymore." And it's only because we do work together that I got to hear that story and bring that back to part of our advocacy in Australia to, discount that claim that's why we need live export for a halal death.
Wow, that's an amazing story. So I guess we have 8 minutes left.
More questions.
I can't keep track of all these wonderful questions. I mean, they were amazing stuff. Ian, did something pop up that makes something we might address?
Well, there's a very interesting one that's come in about the relationship between nutrition and metabolic health, and that's something perhaps that agroecology can address as well. So I don't know if you've got anything to say on that, either of you, but it's I suppose the question's relating to the ability for individual immune response to be linked to better nutrition, and that link from food culture to agroecology. How much is that necessary?
I have such mixed feelings about that question because it comes up often, and it's a good one. On the one hand, you're absolutely right. I mean, food density and diet is an important part of people's immunity. But I often find it also, I'm not saying that this person who asked us is doing this, but it's also wrapped up in questions of lifestyle politics and stuff. And there's a lot of poor people here in the United States who can't afford nutrient dense food right now, and it has to do with the economy bifurcated into a few rich who can afford organics and a large population of poor people who are just trying to survive. I mean, so I'm not saying that is necessarily leads into kind of a condemnation of poor people for choosing foods that lead to a decline in depressed immunity, but I think I think we need to wrap this into, the bigger picture of the larger political economies that are driving the kind of, there's the other version of the racial capitalism. I mean, we talked about it in terms of producers and at the global level, global north and south and within countries, and how that's coming out here in the U.S. Many of the meatpacking plants are being kept open, and black and brown people who are workers who are there are getting the worst of COVID. But that goes on the other end, and in terms of consumers as well. And I think the question isn't always about what we bring to market and how we can market ourselves as being food is better than a vaccine or something. I think the head of Whole Foods says we don't need healthcare because if you're eating well, then you won't get sick. It's his argument, right? And we don't want to take that argument, right? We want to run away from that. People deserve to have healthcare everywhere. They deserve to have nutrient-dense food. Farmers deserve to be paid to produce that food. We need to, undercut the subsidy programs for agribusiness and direct them more in direction where we move away from these awful vicious cycles and more toward these virtuous cycles where farmers are paid to treat the land well, grow good food, and people can afford to eat it. One last point is Jahi Chappelle wrote a book on on Belo Horizonte in Brazil, in which that kind of intervention was undertaken in the city of 2.5 million people, and you have the city paid its farmers on the hinterland to grow good nutrient-dense food, take care of the land, and they cut out the usurious middlemen so that these farmers can sell direct, not only to at markets, but also at municipal restaurants, at schools. And so there's an example in which amazing work's being done in the global south, and we need to start taking notes here up in the global north.
Yeah, I think the systemic approach to the problems of nutrition and diseases of lifestyle, which are largely class-based and racially based, I think that's critical to answering that question. And you can go back like a little bit further to things like the loss of nixtamalizing corn for tortillas in the Americas. You can look at the polishing of rice to lose the the germplasms, and so there are so many ways that you can keep looking back at the way that our traditional foods were destroyed all around the world, and people no longer have access to. It doesn't have to be fancy, just actually nutritious whole foods that are no longer available, especially to urban environments. Although not only, that's a silly thing to say. So of course, nutrient-dense food is going to help with all of our metabolic health. Absolutely. But now the question is, what's the right question? What are the right questions to ask us about how to get there? And that's about really serious systemic reform so that everyone has access to those foods.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, both. I mean, it's a fantastic conversation, and I think some really useful things came out of that. And I think you addressed lots of the questions very well. I mean, it's impossible to answer them all, I guess. But I think the themes that came across for me, the strongest were, first of all, we need to be very careful about notions of nature being separated from society, and all of that being used either for corporate benefit or for kind of petty bourgeois organizations like big NGOs and that kind of stuff. And to counter that, one of the key elements which came through, and I think looking at the pandemic research for the people work, is the notion and the significance of solidarity. The solidarity between agroecologists, whether that's Indigenous or peasant-based, or the little gems of hope that are planted within Western agriculture itself, like through the ORFC and other mechanisms, and things like the urban working class and the poor and things like that. And I think that's got to be the key thing. We don't want to be divided out off the back of a pandemic and be treated as if these issues are not relevant. So thank you very much. I think those things came through really strongly. So it's brilliant, and I hope everybody who listened or who came got something from that meeting. It has been recorded. And just to let you know, one of the jobs I have is I work for the Real Farming Trust, and we're setting up a college for real farming and food culture. And these sort of sessions will be the kind of thing that we dig into a bit more deeper through those things. So keep an eye on that as the rest of the ORFC develops. Thanks very much, both, and good hunting.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to everyone at the Oxford Real Farming Conference for having us. And the sun is up now in Australia. I can go have the rest of the day.
Very good. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Frost off my head.
Just one last thing. If you're interested in looking up more on pandemic research for the people, we're at prepthepeople.net. So be happy to see you over there.
Well done, Rob. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.